Do you remember a time when you were utterly exhausted? Maybe it had been a really, really long day and you were completely spent and empty. My name's Ron. I am grateful to get to serve Berean on our pastor team. And we have joining us this morning our campuses in Bainbridge, in Cincy, and Hillcrest, and online. If you just give a warm welcome to all of them with me. We're glad you guys are with us. So yes, I've been exhausted at least a couple times in my life. Maybe a few more than a couple. At least a few. One of those times was my first year at grad school. I was a brand new husband, and my wife and I found ourselves exhausted. We would get up every morning at 4 a.m. to be able to, my wife had to be at work at 5 a.m., so we had to get ready for the day, get her off to work, and then I would go to the library and I would read in preparation for my Greek class that started at 6:30. So Greek at 6:30 a.m., and so I prepare that way, and then the whole morning was filled with classes and study and research and reading and all the things. In the afternoon, I spent the whole afternoon working for a cabinet shop. So built kitchen cabinets and finished them. And then in the evening, I went to UPS from 7 to 11 to load 3 semi-trailers every night with packages to go all over the United States, mostly Harrisburg and north. And so I spent all that time. When I got done at 11, we ran back to school so I could pick up my wife and we could slip into bed around midnight. And that worked for a little while, not real long, and I found myself exhausted, and maybe you can guess, I just couldn't catch up on rest. It just didn't happen. Every week I seemed to be getting more and more exhausted until one night we had a wake-up call. My wife woke up dazed and a bit stunned to find me at the end of the bed on all fours, yanking on her leg, yelling, "Just another box, just another box." We kind of realized that loading her into the UPS truck was not the answer, and we needed to make a change. We had to think through things a little bit. I was exhausted. Do you ever get completely exhausted? Wasted. See, constant hard work, long hours can leave us fatigued, can leave us worn out. Sometimes emotional swings can tire us out, or stressful situations. They can just zap our energy. We can feel wiped out. High anxiety over maybe an emergency situation. Maybe you're constantly trying to replay in your mind a failure. Maybe your brain is working through a solution all day long and you just keep thinking and thinking and thinking. And all of those things can leave us worn out and completely bone weary. When this happens, what do you do to recharge? How do you recharge? Maybe you're like me. If you're physically exhausted, you'd like to just curl up with a pillow on your bed and a nice blanket and get some zonking, completely out sleep. Maybe if you're mentally mush, you just need to sit in a good armchair and veg out on a good movie, or pick up a good book, or listen to some soothing music. Probably what you need to recharge and to reset is not what created the exhaustion in the first place, but something different entirely. Maybe if you're socially exhausted, you just want to go out and take a walk or get a run, do some exercises or pump some iron. What do you do to get recharged? See, those reactions we often call me time, right? I want to get some me time. I need some alone time for myself so I can rest, so I can recharge. And so maybe you've been working all day really hard at your job and you are following directions, you're getting projects done, you are getting things done at work, or maybe you're at home and you're just checking off the mile-long checklist you have to do before you can go away on that needed vacation. Maybe you're at home and you're chasing your toddler around the living room for the 14th time that hour. And you're worn out. And you just need some alone time. Your time is limited. You just want a few minutes to yourself. Is that too much to ask? It doesn't sound too much to ask. So what might Jesus do? We're going to take a look this morning at a situation where Jesus found himself exhausted, completely exhausted, where he needed some alone time. Let's check it out together. We're going to be in Mark chapter 6 and on page 807 in the Chair Bible. If you need a Bible at any of our campuses, if you'd like one of these, go ahead and take it. It's our gift to you. It's our investment in your faith journey. And we're excited to give away Bibles. We're going to be on page 807, Mark chapter 6. Just weeks earlier than this, Jesus had been back home but when he went back to his hometown, the reunion wasn't exactly met with open arms. And we kind of talked about that last week. Jesus was rejected by the very people that he grew up with, by the people that he knew the best. And although rejection hurts, Jesus kept on going because he knew that the towns and the villages right around where they were at still needed to hear the truth. They needed teaching. They needed healing. They needed the work of Jesus in their life. And so even beyond him pressing forward, he wanted to accelerate that process. So he sent out teams, 6 teams of 2, his disciples, to go out and continue to serve people, to teach, to heal. Check out verses 30 and 31. The apostles returned to Jesus. So they've been out on this mission. They've been 2 by 2. And they returned to Jesus from their ministry tour, and they told him all that they had done and all that they had taught. Then Jesus said, "Let's go off by ourselves to a quiet place and rest a while." We need some time alone. We need to recharge. He said this because there were so many people coming and going that Jesus and the disciples, the apostles, didn't even have time to eat. That's a recipe for tiredness. So they left the boat for a quiet place where they could be alone. So Jesus says, let's get in the boat, let's sail off, let's go to a quiet place to rest. And that sounds great, right? They were going to get the much needed rest that they had been waiting for. And Jesus and his friends, the physical exhaustion, the emotional exhaustion, the mental exhaustion, it's been setting in for a while. And they needed some alone time because they had been continually serving and continually putting other people first. They couldn't even take time to eat. So now they would finally get some reprieve, wouldn't they? They're going to get off alone. Well, not so much. The people recognize them in the boat. So as they're sailing away to go to this quiet place, the people around the shore, they recognize them, and a huge crowd starts following them around the side of the lake. And Jesus couldn't get away. If we had been in Jesus' place, I think we would be irritated, frustrated, ready to turn the boat around and sail back on the other side of the lake, trying to get a little time alone. But Jesus responds differently. Take a look at verse 34. Jesus saw the huge crowd as he stepped from the boat. He didn't turn the boat around. He actually landed it and stepped out. And he had compassion on them. He had compassion on them. Look at what it says next. Because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things. He sees the people, and his heart goes out to them. He begins to teach them. And as he's teaching them many things, you can picture everyone wanted to be near Jesus. They wanted to see a miracle. They wanted to experience the stories that they had been told. And they didn't want to leave. No one wanted to leave that day. And as the day grows late and the sun begins to set, the crowd is so large and the place is so remote that even at dinner time, it seems impossible to be able to feed all the people. But Jesus did the impossible. He did a miracle, and he fed everyone. Everyone. 5,000 men, plus their families. He served the huge crowd. He took 5 loaves and 2 fish, and he divided them and multiplied them, and the food just never stopped until everyone was fed. Can you imagine being there that day? You probably want to come back the next day for more. Immediately after this, verse 45, immediately after this, Jesus insisted that his disciples get back into that boat and head across the lake to Bethsaida. Well, he sent all the people home. And after telling everybody their goodbyes, he went up into the hills by himself to pray. Picture the length of the day and everything that he's endured over the last few weeks and all the work and all the missed opportunities for rest. Jesus needs some time alone in prayer with God the Father. He needs the spiritual reconnect, the recharge, and it was long overdue. Jesus needed some me time. And for him, his me time was prayer and a spiritual reconnect with God the Father. Look at verse 47. Late that night, the disciples were in their boat in the middle of the lake. And Jesus was alone on land. And he looks out, and he saw that they were in serious trouble. Rowing hard and struggling against the wind and the waves. A storm had blown in, and they were struggling. So Jesus cuts his me time short because he realized the disciples needed help. Look on. About 3 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came toward them, walking on the water. How many of you can do that? This is walking on the water? Initially, he intends to go past them, so he intended to go past them. But when they saw him walking on the water, they cried out in terror. They're very afraid, thinking that he was a ghost. They were all terrified when they saw him. Let's take a second to imagine you're one of the disciples that night. You're rowing in the darkness, and it is very dark because it's way past midnight. You're in the middle of a bad storm. The wind is howling, the rain is pouring in, the waves are crashing. You're soaked to the skin. Your butt is hurting from sitting on that hard wooden seat. And your hands are sore and worn from rowing. And each agonizing pull of that oar, you're getting nowhere. As the waves crash in, you're trying to fight and you're getting nowhere. And you happen to look out past your oar, and you see someone standing in the middle of the lake. What's your initial thought? Your heart, I think, begins to pound. Your adrenaline kicks in. Someone's standing on the water. Standing on the water? No one can do that. Certainly not in the middle of this big lake. It must be a ghost. It's a spirit. But wait a second. It looks like Jesus. But no, I left him back on the land. He's up in the mountain. It can't be Jesus. And one of your friends yells out, cries out at the same time, and you realize that everybody else is kind of seeing the same thing you are. You're starting to tremble with fear. Maybe you want to run away, but you're in the middle of the lake, so you can't run away. You can't even loosen the grip on your oar. You're so terrified. You start to feel lightheaded, and you wonder if you're going to pass out. But then the ghost starts talking, and it sure sounds like Jesus. Listen to his words. But Jesus spoke to them at once. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid, he said. Take courage. Take courage. I am here. Don't have fear. Have confidence instead. Why? Because I am here. And Jesus, he began walking right beside the boat. He begins to pass by. He's trying to comfort them with his power. And he says, I am here. In Exodus chapter 3, God presents himself to Moses for the very first time with these words, I am. I am. And Jesus, I think, is identifying with God's power, his presence, his self-existence. He's there for them. And this should have been reassuring. And Jesus was there. He was with them. They don't need to be afraid. The disciples don't need to worry because Jesus is there. He's got this. But his friends weren't calming down. So Jesus, instead of passing by, verse 51, then he climbed into the boat. And the wind stopped. And they were totally amazed. For they still didn't understand the significance of the miracle of the loaves from the day before. Think of Jesus without frustration, in compassion. Jesus quit walking by and he stepped into the boat. Everything goes still. I expect that the disciples at the point are reaching out to see if they can touch Jesus, to see if he's really there. Is this really not a ghost? This is our master. Jesus has compassion because his disciples were quaking in fear. And he changes his plans. He doesn't walk on by. He doesn't go back to his alone time. He doesn't spend more time in prayer. He steps into the boat and does that for the disciples. Jesus served unselfishly. He cared about them in their need. Earlier that night, Jesus needed time alone, but he set it aside to come out on the lake to help the disciples in their storm. Jesus served unselfishly. The day before, Jesus and the disciples, they were looking for a quiet place to be alone, to rest, to eat. And they set that aside to serve the crowd. Jesus had compassion. He taught. He healed. He provided. And Jesus was always serving, wasn't he? Serving even when he needed me time. Even when he needed some alone time. But the disciples didn't understand. They didn't quite get it yet. Time and time again, the disciples had seen Jesus provide exactly what was needed in the exact situation. And here was one more instance. In God's power, Jesus could provide. And yet they were continuing to struggle with faith. Why? Look at the end of that verse. Verse 52. Their hearts were too hard to take it in. They couldn't quite see it yet. So they didn't quite understand the day before. They didn't understand what had just happened. They weren't quite sure what was going on. They were struggling with faith. And even so, Jesus served. He didn't become frustrated. He didn't become put out. And at this point, the disciples really have no idea that Jesus' main mission was to serve mankind's biggest need and to die for us, to take away our sin. And Jesus did that for us. When our plans are interrupted, when our me time disappears, we can get frustrated, can't we? We can react harshly sometimes. And yet that's not how Jesus reacted. I think trusting in God in the interruption, it'll help us. It'll enable us to have compassion on people, to help people, to reach out for people. And Jesus was exhausted. He was exhausted from the rejection. He was exhausted from the constant barrage of the crowds. He was exhausted from the teaching, even from the lack of faith. But he set aside his time. And Jesus needed time alone. He needed a spiritual reconnect. He needed me time. He deserved it, didn't he? If anyone deserved it, Jesus did. But even so, Jesus served unselfishly. Check out what happens next. Verse 53. After they had crossed the lake, they landed at Gennesaret. Does anybody remember where they were headed? No one's going to answer. All right, we'll find out. So they landed at Gennesaret. They brought the boat to shore, and they climbed out. And what do you know? The people recognized Jesus at once. And they ran throughout the whole area, carrying sick people on mats to wherever they heard he was. Wherever he went, in the villages, in the cities, or the countryside, they brought the sick out to the marketplaces. They begged him to let the sick touch at least the fringe of his robe. And all who touched him were healed. No rest for the weary. So if you look back, previously, they were headed to Bethsaida, not to Gennesaret. And Bethsaida is the hometown of Peter, Andrew, and Philip. And I think it would have been nice to sit and relax a little bit in their homes. Maybe get some more rest. But that's not where they end up. God uses the storm and he takes them off track and they land in Gennesaret about 5 miles away. Because the people there, they needed Jesus. And so they're met at the shore by the crowds and they just couldn't get away. Jesus couldn't get away. But Jesus kept serving unselfishly. Our time on earth is limited, isn't it? Some of us feel that more than others at different times. There's only 24 hours in a day. As much as I would have loved a little more time at UPS or the cabinet shop or studying, or you know what, I would have rather just have a little more time that night. But we only get 24 hours in a day. We only get 7 days in a week. We only get 365 days in a year. And we only have so many years. Work and responsibilities take a huge chunk of that time. And then we have our schedules and events and recreation. We have our families and our homes to take care of. And society tells us, your time is limited, so make the most of it. Do the things that matter most to you. Don't waste time on other people. Be true to yourself, to your goals, to your happiness. Take care of yourself first. You deserve those minutes. You deserve your me time. Do it for you. However, what if there's a different way to look at our time? After all, who gives us our time? God gives us our time, right? Just like our finances, every breath, every day is a gift from God. Like money, we should be good stewards of our time. I know the world around us says, do what matters to you. But what if we thought differently? What if we instead did what matters most? Most in the big picture? Most for eternity? Most for God? Jesus summed up the commandments in the scriptures this way. He said, "You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, and all your strength." Put God first. And he says, secondly, is equally important. So put both of them first. Love your neighbor as yourself. No other commandment is greater than these. Mark 12:30-31. There's some other times Jesus said the exact same thing. Put God first. Put your neighbor first. These are the summation of the scriptures. Love God and love other people. These are the two things that matter most. But our lives can get so busy trying to pursue what we think is important. Our careers, our home, our success, maybe travel, recreation, paying off that next better thing that we want. Trying to get our kids to all their activities. We can let our schedules get packed full with the things that seem urgent, but maybe aren't so important. So then when we get interrupted, we get irritated, we get frustrated, we get upset. And Paul speaks to that in Philippians 2. Verse 3, he says, "Don't be selfish." In other words, let's not put me first and all that I want first and all that I think is first. Now that runs counter to our culture. They said, put you first. Paul says, don't be selfish. Don't try to impress others. Be humble, thinking of others as better than yourselves. Don't look out only for your interest, but take interest in others too. If we're always putting me time first, I think we can miss what is most important. We may miss an opportunity to connect with God and to connect with other people. We might miss the opportunity to love God and to love others. If Jesus could help other people when his plans were interrupted, then what about me? Can I do that too? When my plans are interrupted, when I don't get to do what I want to do, when I need some me time. See, I can choose to serve unselfishly. Or I can put me first. Even when things are inconvenient, I can choose to put other people first. Ask yourself this question. Am I servant-hearted with my time? Am I servant-hearted with my time? How do I react when my schedule is unexpectedly changed or when I'm interrupted? Think about that. Better yet, how would my friend or my spouse describe me when I'm interrupted? How would they describe you? Maybe when you're at work, you're really focused, you're going full speed ahead, but then that coworker misses a deadline, or an extra meeting gets thrown in, or an emergency halts your progress. Are you put out? Are you starting to boil over and steam and blow your top? Or are you glad to help? When you've got the whole week planned out, projects at home, a whole schedule, and a lot to accomplish, but then a friend calls with an emergency or just needs to talk, are you willing to set some things aside and help your friend? When your favorite live TV show is on. I know we probably don't watch as many of those. Maybe the game you've been waiting all week for, and it's on the television, and you're resting, and you're enjoying, and you're all into it. And then your spouse calls out and says, "Would you please help me with the groceries?" Are you ready to jump up in joy to go help her out or him out? I know these are but thens, right? They're just a few examples because it costs us to have a servant's heart. It'll cost us. Even when it's inconvenient, even when it interrupts us, will we be willing to serve? Will we be willing to help? Can we put others first? Maybe in these times or 1,000 more. You know what they are? They're opportunities to serve and love in tangible acts of service. In grad school, I was completely exhausted. And we were just starting out. And I was worn out and getting worn out. There was no margin in my life for my own rest, let alone to invest in people. So I quit UPS. And we decided to live on a little bit less. I got some more rest. And later that enabled me to have opportunity to pour into some young men's lives that were studying and preparing for ministry. And I get to mentor them, help them study to learn to one day serve and to one day teach and to be in ministry. I had to allow God to adjust my schedule, to change my plans. Jesus was willing to adjust his schedule. He was willing to set aside his time to invest in other people. Are you willing to allow God to adjust your schedule so you can help others? So loving God, you can love other people. I know this requires a mindset shift. It requires a whole different way to look at your time. Remember a few things. Ultimately, your time is God's time. Be a good steward of it. Use it not just for what matters most to you, but what matters most. Plan some margin, maybe put some slack into your life. Try not to be 100% booked, and that'll change your mindset. If you're not 100% booked, when needs arise, you're going to have a little more willingness to hit the pause button and help. And then look at those opportunities when the interruptions come. Look at them as God's opportunity to reach out with his hands, to go with his feet, to share his love. It's not just an interruption. It's an opportunity to live for Jesus. Allow God to adjust your schedule. I think when we are willing to share, when we're willing to help other people, when we're willing to give them our time, we're going to start seeing their hearts melt. We might just get a chance to love them with God's love. And they might just ask why. If we're full speed ahead, never slowing down and never having a chance to reach out to someone else, we'll never have the chance to share God's love. But when we slow down, when we take an interruption and use it as an opportunity for God's love, we're going to have the chance to share the love that God has shared with us. We'll get a chance to treat other people unconditionally like God treated us unconditionally. And when we allow God to adjust our schedule, he's going to give us more and more opportunities to do what matters for eternity, to do what matters most to him, and to help other people. Would you take a moment this morning to pray with me and to think with me? God, as I've been studying and reading and preparing, God, you're working on my heart. Because my reaction in the interruption isn't always like Jesus. God, help me to reflect your Son. But I think about the disciples in this passage, and they didn't understand, and they lacked faith. But Jesus loved them anyway, and he never gave up on them. And God, you're not going to give up on me, and you're not going to give up on any one of us here. Not here in Green, not in Cincy and Bainbridge and Hillcrest and any one of your children. God, you love us. And we got to grow. God, help us to see our time as your time. Help us to be willing to love other people unconditionally. We're here this morning at each one of our campuses. Think about this. What can you do this week to react more like Jesus in an interruption? What can you do this week to serve like Jesus? God, thank you for never giving up on us. If there's someone here that has never accepted the mission you came and sent your Son for, God, would you open their heart today? And they just tell you and speak to you right now, saying, I have sinned. I've fallen short. I am not as good and as perfect as you, God. I couldn't come to you myself. I couldn't do enough to be good. But I believe that you've done it for me. I believe that you have paid for my sin. I believe that you love me and you want me as your child. Would you forgive me, God? Would you accept me? If they've done that this morning, I just encourage them to reach out to any of their campus leaders or the teams at their campuses, here to Alyssa, to myself, to any of our music team and the great team here at Berean. We want to love you and welcome you into God's family. You've got a new faith family today. And for some of us, we've been living in that love for a while. God, help us to just live it out. When it's inconvenient, when it's an interruption, help us to live out your love, God. And to put you first. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.